Welcome back to the Supervisor Skills Training Podcast. Jordan, today we are diving into what can feel like the least favorite part of any manager's job, but arguably the most crucial, employee documentation.
Absolutely, Alex. This training module, Employee Documentation, is part of Supervisor Skills Training Series, and honestly, it underpins everything we do. If you look at the cover slide, it emphasizes building consistency, accountability, and clarity in staff management. None of that happens without solid documentation.
Right. And if we look at the key objectives right away, they set the stage. We need to understand why documentation is essential, identify what needs documenting, learn to write clearly and factually, follow standards, and maintain confidentiality. But for our listeners today, especially those supervisors who dread sitting someone down for it, how does documentation help us set boundaries?
It's the backbone of boundary setting, Alex. When you have to address an issue, maybe someone is consistently late or perhaps they are oversharing client details, that documentation proves you had the conversation. It shifts the interaction from he said, she said, or I vaguely mentioned this once to a structured professional coaching moment. It makes your boundaries real and enforceable.
That moves perfectly into why documentation matters. Legal protection is huge, obviously, serving as evidence. But I want to focus on accountability and communication. When you document, you are clarifying expectations and progress. If I set a boundary, say, Justin, you must not discuss client medication refusal with colleagues, and I document that conversation, the boundary is now crystal clear for him.
Exactly. And that clarity is violence management too. If Justin continues to breach confidentiality, the documentation shows a pattern of growth needed, not just a sudden punitive action. It supports compliance, but more importantly for the supervisor on the ground, it supports you in managing the team fairly. If you don't document the action, how can you hold someone accountable when they cross it?
Let's get practical about what we actually write down. Page 5 lists 5 key areas: performance, behavior, conduct, training, supervision, corrective actions, and positive contributions. If we focus on the difficult conversations aspect, performance issues like poor work quality, attendance, or punctuality all require you to initiate a conversation, correct?
They do. And those conversations are where boundaries are tested. Take behavior and conduct, professionalism, teamwork, adherence to policy. If an employee's conduct and team morale, that's a direct boundary violation against the team environment. You have to address the lack of professionalism immediately. Documenting the specific behavior, not your feeling about it, is step 1.
Let's test this with case study 1, the one about Justin. We have a supervisor, Todd, getting complaints about Justin causing a negative environment by constantly complaining. Then, a serious grievance. A client overhears Justin discussing another client refusing meds. The grievance was handled, and Justin was spoken to about confidentiality. Sounds like a conversation.
It sounds like a reactive conversation happened. But look at what happens next 4 or 5 weeks later. Another staff member, Tina, refuses to work a shift with Justin due to his attitude and complaining. Todd goes to HR to recommend termination, but HR finds nothing documented regarding previous issues, no notes on the general complaints, and crucially, no formal documentation regarding the confidentiality breach conversation they supposedly had.
This is where the training hits home. HR tells Todd he has to start over, have a conversation, start retraining, coaching, and then move to warnings. Screams failure to set and document initial boundaries. The confidentiality breach alone should have resulted in immediate, documented coaching on policy adherence.
And that's a huge practical takeaway for supervisors. If you have a difficult conversation, especially about sensitive topics like confidentiality or creating a negative environment, that conversation must be documented. It's not just about tracking discipline, it's about tracking coaching efforts. If you don't document that initial talk about confidentiality, HR cannot support termination later because, from an official record standpoint, Justin has a clean slate.
Our boundary issue here wasn't just Justin's behavior, but Todd's failure to enforce the process consistently. We need to talk about how to document that initial conversation effectively, because that leads us right into the documentation standards on page 10. The key phrase here is, be factual and objective. Opinions.
This is critical when setting boundaries. If Todd documented Justin is negative and unprofessional, that's an opinion. That's subjective. The standard tells us to use the checkmark example. Employee arrived 20 minutes late on 10/28. For Justin's case, a factual entry would be, met with Justin regarding client confidentiality breach after client X overheard discussion of client Y refusing medication. Reviewed confidentiality policy sections 3.1 and 3.2. Employee acknowledged understanding of policy.
That factual documentation turns a vague coaching moment into an actionable record that supports future discipline if the boundary is crossed again. It also helps us maintain professionalism, which is another standard mentioned: be specific, timely, consistent, and professional. If you wait until Tina refuses, you've lost timeliness.
And this leads us beautifully into case study 2, which addresses the missing step in setting boundaries when dealing with lateness. An employee is habitually late, causing overtime for others. That's a clear boundary violation impacting team resources. The supervisor has time punch records and a confidential note in the file. The question is anything missing?
The answer, according to page 9, is huge. The missing part was the supervisor having a conversation with the employee and documenting the conversations. This emphasizes that documentation isn't just about writing down what happened. It's about documenting the process of managing behavior.
Precisely. Having the time punch data is factual evidence, but it's not coaching. To set that boundary effectively, the supervisor needed to initiate a conversation. I see you were late 3 times this week. This causes overtime for Sarah. What is happening, and what is the plan to ensure you are on time moving forward? That conversation and the resulting agreement must be documented.
This ties into writing effective documentation on page 12. The example there is gold for trying to have tough talks. During supervision on 10/29, discussed 3 tardies this month. Reviewed attendance policy. Employee agreed to arrive early and update weekly. See how it includes the fact, the policy reference, and the employee's commitment, the agreed-upon boundary, and
that structure is how you turn a confrontation into a coaching session. You use clear, neutral language, stick to facts, include employee input, reference policy, and end with next steps. If you skip the conversation, you skip the input and the agreed-upon next step, leaving you with just a pile of data points that are definitive rather than developmental.
Let's discuss the types of documentation listed on slide 11, because each type relates to a different stage of boundary setting. Observation notes record behavior. That's for the early factual recording. Supervision notes track meetings and goals. This is where we are stressing.
Incident reports are for policy or safety issues, like Justin's confidentiality slip-up. Corrective actions are formal discipline, the step after coaching attempts fail. And refusal to sign, that's documentation confirming the employee acknowledged receipt, even if they disagree with content. All these tools help you maintain professional boundaries without getting drawn into emotional arguments during the discussion itself.
Speaking of emotional arguments, let's look at common documentation mistakes on page 13. This list is essentially a cheat sheet on how to fail at difficult conversations. Waiting too long, using biased language, missing key details, these all undermine your credibility when you finally try to enforce a boundary.
If you wait 3 weeks to talk about an issue because it was uncomfortable, you've signaled to the employee that the boundary isn't important. When you finally easily dismiss it because the immediacy is gone. If you use emotional language like, I am frustrated by your constant negativity, you've made it about your feelings, not their professional conduct.
And keeping personal or secret notes. That's a massive boundary violation on the supervisor's part. If it's not in the official file, it doesn't exist for HR or legal purposes, and it certainly shouldn't be used as leverage against an employee later. If you have a thought about an employee, it needs to be documented factually, following the process, or it needs to be deleted.
That relates directly to confidentiality. Store securely, share only with HR and leadership. You never discuss staff performance with others, not colleagues, not even trusted peers outside the management structure. Maintaining that professional boundary around sensitive employee data is non-negotiable for supervisors.
Look at the structure for escalation, the corrective action process on page 15. This is the formalized pathway when initial coaching and boundary setting attempts fail. Step 1 is the verbal warning, which must be documented internally. Then Step 2, written warning. Step 3, and Step 4, final warning or termination.
For supervisors dreading the tough conversation, this structure provides a roadmap. You are never springing termination on someone without documentation showing the progressive steps taken. And notice what must be included in those formal steps: policy reference, employee response, action plan, timeline, and signatures. Each formal step requires dialogue where the employee must respond or acknowledge the path forward.
That employee response section is crucial for demonstrating fairness. It shows you listen to their side, even if you a policy. It proves you didn't just dictate terms. You engaged in a difficult, but necessary, professional exchange. If an employee refuses to sign, that refusal itself becomes documented evidence of their participation in the process.
Thinking back to Justin in case study 1, if Todd had documented complaint about his complaining behavior, he could have started the process before the confidentiality breach happened. If he had documented the conversation about the confidentiality breach immediately, the next issue, Tina refusing to work with him, would have moved straight to a written warning or PIP, rather than requiring a full restart of coaching.
It highlights that documentation isn't just a retrospective task. It's a proactive management tool that enables you to set firm, fair boundaries in real time. Let's summarize the supervisor responsibilities from page 16. Document accurately and promptly, review documentation with staff, follow up on progress, maintain fairness, and consult HR.
The responsibility to review documentation with staff is key to boundary setting. When you have that serious conversation about lateness or conduct, you should ideally review what you are writing down with them, or at least share the summary of expectations after. This ensures mutual understanding of the boundary and the agreed consequences.
And the follow-up is where the boundary is either maintained or eroded. If you document that the employee agreed to stop discussing certain topics and you don't check in, you've set a weak boundary. Consistent follow-up shows you are serious standard.
Let's expand on that practical element of follow-up conversations. Say you coached an employee on punctuality, documented the agreement to arrive by 8:30 a.m. 2 weeks later, they are late at 8:45 a.m. The follow-up conversation needs to be swift and neutral. You reference the previous documentation without dwelling on the history, focusing only on the current breach and the next step in the corrective action process.
A good script for that tough follow-up might sound like this. Jordan, we spoke on October 29th regarding attendance, and we agreed that 8:30 a.m. required start time, which we documented. Today is November 12th, and you arrived at 8:45 a.m. That is a failure to meet the documented expectation. We need to discuss why this happened, and based on our policy, this now moves us to a formal written warning that is direct, factual, and respects the established process.
That scripting is invaluable because it prevents you from getting sidetracked into debating whether they were late. The documentation already established that fact. You are simply executing the agreed-upon consequence. Supervisors often struggle because they try to reach the issue during the follow-up. The documentation frees you from that trap.
Let's revisit the what should be documented list one more time, focusing on positive contributions. We often talk about discipline, but documenting achievements and client feedback is also vital for balance and fairness. How does documenting positive contributions support boundary setting?
It builds credibility and rapport. If you are constantly documenting only negative interactions, every conversation feels adversarial. When you bring up a corrective action, the employee is less likely to feel ambushed if they also have a file full of documentation showing when they met goals, received positive feedback, or successfully completed training. It shows you see the whole picture, making your enforcement of boundaries seem measured rather than biased.
That's a great point about maintaining the supervisor-employee relationship. If the documentation is purely punitive, the employee stops seeing you as a coach and starts seeing you only as an enforcer. We want them to see us as someone invested in their success, provided they adhere to the core operational boundaries.
Let's elaborate on the standards of writing, specifically being specific and timely. For supervisors struggling with boundaries, specific means avoiding generalizations about